The blazing Sonoran sun had already risen high at 6:30 a.m. as I stepped out onto my small driveway, wiping the persistent beads of sweat from my brow. My name is Terry Miles, a proud homeowner who had finally managed to secure my own little slice of suburban paradise in the outskirts of Red Mesa. After years of scrimping and saving, I had finally bought a sleek midnight silver Audi, a trophy for all the long nights and hard work I'd endured as a systems architect at a tech firm in Tempe. That morning, my heart swelled with satisfaction as I listened to the definitive click of the last security camera snapping into place along my property's perimeter. After several strange incidents, a trampled succulent, a mysteriously dented garbage bin, I decided enough was enough. I wasn't about to let any unwanted surprises intrude into my carefully crafted sanctuary. With the new cameras installed and a crisp live feed appearing on my smartphone, complete with wide-angle and night vision capabilities, I couldn't help but pat myself on the back. Still immersed in my moment of triumph, I heard the doorbell ring. I assumed it was the delivery for my celebratory taco platter and iced coffee. Instead, when I opened the door, I was met with the cold, disapproving glare of my neighbor, Cassandra Everett. Cassandra, always impeccably groomed, with her platinum blonde hair and an expression that oscillated between condescension and indignation, served as the unofficial neighborhood watch captain for our cul-de-sac. Known for her endless unsolicited opinions, she was not at all pleased with my new security setup. Her eyes narrowed as she swept her gaze over my modest home, her voice syrupy and excessively polite. "Mr. Miles, I must ask, what exactly is going on with all these contraptions on your property?" She gestured vaguely toward my new cameras with a hand laden with too many rings, as if they were priceless heirlooms. I smiled, trying to keep the tone friendly yet assertive. "Cassandra, I installed these cameras as a precaution. Recent events have made it clear that security is a necessity. I'm within my rights, in fact, I have all the HOA approvals." My voice reflected both pride and a hint of defensiveness. But Cassandra was having none of it. "Oh, I'm sure you are," she drawled, her words laced with subtle venom. "Some people might find such surveillance rather intimidating. We have rules, you see, about maintaining the harmony of our community." With that, she turned on her heel, muttering about declining property values and the wrong sort of residents, and marched away toward her flawlessly manicured front yard. I closed the door and exhaled slowly. Despite my triumph with the cameras, Cassandra's disapproval had cast an unwelcome shadow over what should have been a celebratory morning. I knew in my gut that her interference was just the beginning of a series of challenges that lay ahead in this delicate suburban ecosystem. Today, at least, I had secured my property, but little did I know that my new defenses would soon capture far more than just unwanted critters. They would document the unraveling of a deeper, more disturbing neighborhood feud. Later that day, the scorching desert heat had only intensified, and as I settled into my newly fortified living room to admire the crystal-clear images streaming from my freshly installed security cameras, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I always loved the sense of control that came with watching every corner of my property, but today my gaze was drawn repeatedly to a small dark shape moving along the edge of my yard. In the feed's wide-angle view, I noted a figure resembling my neighbor Cassandra Everett. My mind raced. Had she returned to deliver another dose of criticism, or was there something more sinister afoot? Before I could process my thoughts any further, the doorbell rang again. Expecting the pizza, or perhaps a more pompous visit from Cassandra, I hesitantly approached the door. I opened it to reveal not a delivery person but a flustered postal worker, who hesitated before handing me a letter without a return address. The envelope was neatly stamped, and a neat, formal script read, "Notice from the Red Mesa Estates Homeowners Association." My heart sank as I realized that the HOA, ever vigilant about community standards, had taken an interest in my security enhancements. I quickly retreated to my study and examined the letter. The notice was a formal reprimand stating that my new security system constituted a violation of several obscure aesthetics bylaws. They claimed that the presence of cameras, with their wide-angle and night vision capabilities, invaded the privacy of the neighborhood and potentially lowered property values. According to the notice, I was required to remove the devices immediately or face legal action. I couldn't help but let a bitter smile creep across my face. I'd done nothing illegal, and the mere suggestion that my precautions were a threat to community harmony was laughable. Sitting at my desk, I replayed the video footage from earlier that morning. The high-definition clarity of the cameras clearly captured every movement around my home. I was especially proud of the night vision mode that rendered every shadow in stark relief. I even caught brief glimpses of odd behavior, a stray cat, a misdirected delivery, but nothing serious. My sense of security, however, was tainted by the knowledge that the HOA's notice would no doubt become fodder for local gossip. As the hours passed, I could almost hear the murmurs growing around the neighborhood. At the local community center, I overheard snippets of conversation about my unsightly surveillance setup and speculations about why a homeowner would invest so heavily in security technology. It wasn't long before a neighbor, clearly irritated, mentioned that the red tape of the HOA would soon force me to dismantle my beloved cameras. Anger began to churn within me, not at the law itself, but at the arrogance of an institution that dictated how I should protect my own property. Determined not to let this bureaucratic intrusion stand, I resolved to dig deeper. I pored over the HOA's regulations, scrutinizing every clause. Every word reeked of outdated assumptions about what a neighborhood should look like. I compared these archaic rules with the clear evidence of my legal approvals and the objective superiority of my security technology. By midday, armed with digital copies of emails and photographs of official HOA approval stamps, I prepared a detailed rebuttal. I planned to respond formally and, if necessary, seek legal counsel to defend my right to secure my home. In the background of this small bureaucratic battle, my security feed continued to record the everyday rhythms of my property. I watched, almost absent-mindedly, as my cameras captured the sun blazing over the desert and the subtle activities of local wildlife. Yet, amidst those ordinary images, there was a looming feeling of tension, a sense that the coming days would not be as placid as I had hoped. The HOA was not known for its leniency, and the formal notice was just the first salvo in what might become a drawn-out war over personal privacy and individual rights. By the end of the day, I knew that I was caught between the hard edge of technological progress and the stubborn resistance of outdated tradition. My new security cameras, which were meant to provide peace of mind, had unwittingly set the stage for a confrontation not just with the HOA, but with the very spirit of suburban conformity. And so, under the unforgiving desert sky, I braced myself for the impending battle, a battle where my right to protect my own home would be pitted against a system determined to impose its archaic standards by force. In the days that followed, my once tranquil existence in Red Mesa began to fracture along unexpected lines. The formal reprimand from the HOA had ignited a firestorm of whispered conversations and surreptitious glances among my neighbors. I noticed how, during our community meetings at the local hall, individuals would exchange knowing looks whenever my security cameras were mentioned. It wasn't long before I realized that my personal pursuit of safety had morphed into a symbol of defiance, a lightning rod for those entrenched in the old ways. Cassandra Everett. The imperious neighbor with whom I'd had a brief encounter, seemed to be at the forefront of this campaign. Her rhetoric, always laced with disdain for any deviation from her narrow version of community standards, had grown louder. I began to see her not merely as an overly opinionated busybody, but as a force mobilizing a faction of residents who believed that technology was corrupting the idyllic nature of our cul-de-sac. Every morning, as I sipped my coffee on my front porch while monitoring my camera feeds, I could hear the muted disputes echoing from nearby yards. Some residents quietly defended my right to secure my property, others, swayed by Cassandra's relentless claims, worried that our neighborhood's values were under threat. I even heard rumors that a petition was in the works to force me to remove my cameras, a petition that would likely be spearheaded by Cassandra herself and her like-minded cronies. The tension reached a peak when, one sweltering afternoon, a stern knock rang at my door. I answered it to find a formally dressed representative from the HOA, clipboard in hand and an expression as cold as the desert night. He reiterated the complaint, citing vague but intimidating language about invasion of privacy, and detrimental impact on communal property values. I presented him with the official email confirmations and documentation that showed my installations were fully compliant with all the established guidelines. However, his eyes remained unreadable as he left with a curt warning that the matter would be reviewed at the next board meeting. Over the next few days, I found solace in the silent company of my security feeds. The digital images were sharp, a constant reminder that I was in control of my own domain. Yet, amidst the routine footage of squirrels and stray cats, I began noticing subtle anomalies. Unexplained movements at the edge of the frame, as if someone was watching. At first, I dismissed them as optical glitches or local critters. But one late evening, as the desert grew eerily quiet, I caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. A figure, seemingly draped in a long coat with a purposeful gait, was approaching my property from the street. The camera's night vision revealed the intruder only briefly before it vanished into the darkness. That night, my sleep was restless as I mulled over the implications. Was this simply an overactive imagination fueled by the day's events? Or had the HOA's campaign against me, spearheaded by Cassandra and her allies, escalated into something far more insidious? The idea that someone might be actively surveilling me was as unnerving as it was possible. The notion slowly planted a seed of defiance in my mind. If they wanted to break me, they'd have to deal with every recorded moment of their own doing. I took to meticulously reviewing every frame from the past few nights, documenting any movements or suspicious activity. My findings were inconclusive, yet they spurred me into a state of heightened alertness. I even started mapping out the camera angles and pondering whether I needed to add more coverage to my property. The digital evidence was my new ally, and I intended to use it as both shield and sword in the battles that lay ahead. In the midst of this storm, the community around me appeared divided. Some neighbors discreetly expressed their support, nodding in solidarity when I passed them on the street. Others, however, seemed to smile with thinly veiled satisfaction whenever Cassandra's name was mentioned. It was a bitter pill to swallow, that in my quest for security, I had inadvertently become a lightning rod for old prejudices and petty disputes. By the end of that tumultuous week, it was clear that my struggle was no longer just a personal matter but had become emblematic of the broader conflict between modern progress and outdated norms. I had secured my home with the latest technology, but in doing so, I had also lit the fuse of a cultural confrontation that threatened to split our quiet neighborhood down the middle. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood reached an unexpected climax one late night. I was sitting in my study, reviewing my security camera footage for routine maintenance, when I began to notice something truly disturbing. At exactly 2:15 a.m., one of my external cameras captured a series of movements that sent chills down my spine. The footage showed a figure, shaped unmistakably like Cassandra Everett, creeping along the edge of my property. The camera's night vision mode revealed her figure moving purposefully along the perimeter, then pausing at the corner of my freshly landscaped yard. It was as if she was searching for vulnerabilities or plotting her next move. I rewound the footage several times in disbelief. The clarity was undeniable, a dark silhouette in a well-defined outline, her behavior calculated and surreptitious. The following day, I compiled the clips and meticulously edited a highlight reel, preserving every incriminating second. I backed up the files on multiple hard drives and in the cloud, and even forwarded a copy to my attorney for safekeeping. This evidence, I knew, was about more than just a petty squabble over privacy. It was the proof of a systematic campaign of harassment that had been quietly plaguing our community. As word began to spread among the residents that something was amiss with the security feeds, whispers turned into furtive glances and sideways comments. I started receiving anonymous emails and messages that questioned whether my cameras were too invasive or an eyesore. Yet I knew the truth. The cameras had captured far more than anyone could imagine. They had recorded the clandestine movements of Cassandra herself, not only on my property, but also in the surrounding area. In one particularly damning clip, I saw her lean over a neighbor's low fence and plant what appeared to be a warning, a crudely scribbled note that read, "Keep it in line, or else." The breakthrough came when I received a tip from a trusted friend in the community, who mentioned that similar incidents had been reported by families of color in the area. According to this friend, several residents had experienced late-night acts of vandalism, such as keying cars, spray painting slurs on garage doors, and even slashing tires, actions that bore the unmistakable mark of targeted hate. Connecting the dots, I realized that these acts were being perpetrated by someone whose methods were eerily similar to what I had documented. Fueled by a mixture of righteous anger and determination, I prepared to share the footage with not only the police but also local news outlets and the community watch. I sent an anonymous email to the Neighborhood Security Alliance with a short clip of Cassandra's nocturnal prowling. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Accusations flew, emails piled up, and the hidden underbelly of our once peaceful cul-de-sac began to reveal itself. By mid-afternoon, local reporters contacted me, eager for the story that promised to expose systemic harassment in our quiet suburb. With a sense of reluctant responsibility, I provided them with the edited highlight reel and copies of the original footage. The resulting news segment, though initially blurry in some shots, clearly showed a figure resembling Cassandra engaging in behavior that was more than just nosiness, it was intimidation. That evening, the sound of police sirens filled the desert air as several patrol cars surrounded Cassandra's house. I watched from a safe distance, coffee in hand, as officers knocked on her door and, after what seemed like a prolonged interrogation, led her away in handcuffs. The community, once divided by whispered gossip, now observed with a collective sense of vindication and relief. In that singular moment, the security cameras I had installed transformed from a personal tool of defense into a powerful instrument of justice. The evidence was irrefutable, and through my unwavering vigilance and careful documentation, a reign of fear and hatred was finally being dismantled. As the night wore on, I knew that this was not only a victory for me but a turning point for our entire neighborhood, a step toward exposing and eradicating the darker undercurrents of prejudice that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. In the wake of Cassandra's arrest, the atmosphere throughout Red Mesa began to shift noticeably. What started as a solitary act of vigilance had ignited a local movement, a subtle yet profound awakening among residents who had long endured the corrosive effects of unchecked prejudice. I, Terrence Miles, was thrust into an unexpected role as both protector and exposer of injustice. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with hashtags, #PorchJustice, #EyesOnTruth, and #StandUpRedMesa, capturing public support and galvanizing community voices that had felt silenced for too long. Local news outlets ran stories about the courageous homeowner who had not only installed security cameras to safeguard his property but who had also meticulously documented the nefarious activities of a deranged, envious neighbor. Although I wished for a quiet life, I found myself receiving heartfelt messages of gratitude, encouragement, and even job inquiries from companies that prided themselves on diversity and inclusion. In community meetings, residents who had once been apathetic or complicit in the local status quo now began to question the long-established norms. Elderly neighbors, many of whom had been suspicious of any change, appeared more reflective, while families of color, long subjected to more subtle forms of discrimination, voiced their relief at seeing concrete evidence of long-standing harassment come to light. Even some of those who had once supported the HOA's rigid standards began to quietly acknowledge that perhaps a fresh perspective was needed. Yet, as the days passed, the repercussions for Cassandra extended far beyond the humiliation of an arrest. Her personal and professional life unraveled almost immediately. The real estate firm for which she had worked promptly terminated her employment. Long-standing listings associated with her name were abruptly removed, and whispers about her having a checkered record of similar harassment spread rapidly throughout the community. Local gossip transformed her image from a respected neighborhood watch captain to that of a pariah, a symbol of cruelty and abuse of power. Despite the growing support and acclaim I received, a heaviness lingered in my heart. I wasn't celebrating merely a personal victory, I was mourning the long-term damage inflicted by systemic hate, a damage that extended beyond me to the entire community. Yet, I also recognized that the turning tide was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the quietest suburbs, change was possible. I began attending local forums and community meetings, advocating not only for greater personal security but also for policies that protected every resident's right to privacy and dignity. During one of these gatherings, I presented the well-documented evidence from my security cameras as an example of how technology could serve as a tool for transparency and accountability. The reactions were overwhelmingly positive. Neighbors expressed a renewed sense of empowerment. I found that many were willing to support a call for a revision of the outdated HOA rules that had long prioritized conformity over individual safety and freedom. Over the subsequent weeks, several influential community members and local leaders joined forces to form a grassroots alliance dedicated to protecting homeowner rights. Together, we organized workshops on home security, digital privacy, and civic engagement, ensuring that everyone from first-time buyers to long-time residents had access to the tools to safeguard their property and personal space. In the midst of this activism, the police and local authorities commended the thorough documentation of the incident. It wasn't just the technology that had delivered justice, it was also the courage to document and share the truth. I often recalled that blistering day, when the cameras not only watched over my property but ultimately dismantled a reign of terror perpetrated by one who was supposed to uphold community standards. As the community's collective voice grew stronger, the old guard of exclusionary practices began to crumble. Conversations about fairness, respect, and mutual responsibility filled the town halls and coffee shops. In that crucible of conflict and renewal, I realized that my once private struggle had become a catalyst for a larger movement toward equity in Red Mesa. In the weeks following the explosive revelations and community upheaval, a tentative calm settled over Red Mesa. I found myself at the center of an evolving narrative, one in which technology and vigilance had not only exposed grave injustices but also paved the way for a long-overdue reckoning. Despite the acclaim for what had transpired, the aftermath was far from over. I knew that while one enemy had been unmasked, there was still much healing to be done. Shortly after Cassandra's arrest, I began receiving letters and messages from neighbors whose lives had been touched by her actions. Many expressed gratitude for my determination and for the evidence that validated their own experiences of harassment and subtle discrimination. At local town meetings, voices that had been hushed by fear were now rising in unison to demand reforms in how the HOA governed our community. It became apparent that the incident had catalyzed a broader call for transparency, an insistence on accountability that stretched beyond my own property. At the same time, I couldn't shake the memory of the security feed that had documented every moment of Cassandra's late-night escapades. I spent long evenings reviewing the footage, not out of paranoia, but out of a desire to ensure that justice remained unassailable. I backed up every clip, meticulously organized them, and even discussed the possibility of creating an archive to help affected residents later confront their own harrowing experiences. During this period, I was approached by a local civil rights advocate, Simone Riley, who recognized the significance of my ordeal. Together, we organized a series of community workshops aimed at educating residents on their rights and on using technology for safeguarding personal freedom. Simone's insight was invaluable. She encouraged us to look beyond the scandal and to rebuild a culture of trust and mutual respect among neighbors. Our joint efforts soon led to the establishment of a community integrity project, which aimed at rebalancing the power dynamics within our once silent cul-de-sac. Amid these initiatives, the HOA found itself besieged by multiple complaints and demands for reform. Public pressure mounted, and several board members began to advocate for a comprehensive review of the outdated guidelines that had long privileged uniformity over individual liberty. At one particularly charged community forum, a respected longtime resident tearfully recounted how the very rules that had allowed Cassandra's unchecked behavior had left many marginalized and voiceless. It was a turning point, a call for reconciliation that resonated deeply with everyone present. Despite the many positive developments, I couldn't ignore the personal toll the ordeal had taken. There were moments when the weight of continuous scrutiny and the burden of being a reluctant local hero felt overwhelming. In the solitude of my home, I wrestled with mixed emotions, a blend of righteous vindication and lingering sorrow over the damage that had been inflicted on so many lives. Yet, I also recognized that every challenge was an opportunity to build a better future. One crisp morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I noticed a small group of neighbors gathered to discuss plans for expanding the Community Integrity Project. They talked about more workshops, neighborhood patrols with an emphasis on respect for diversity, and even a revision of the HOA's bylaws to make them more inclusive. Their commitment was inspiring. What began as my personal battle had blossomed into a collective, transformative movement. By the close of that turbulent month, a sense of cautious optimism began to take hold in Red Mesa. I realized that while the scars of the past would never fully fade, they could serve as a foundation for solidarity and growth. The journey from confrontation to reconciliation was neither swift nor smooth, but it had opened up a dialogue that promised lasting change. In our shared struggle, we found the courage to reimagine our community. A place where vigilance went hand in hand with compassion, and where every resident's voice was valued. Not long after the community began to heal, an unexpected development occurred that forced me to confront the human side of this ongoing saga. It was a cool, late afternoon when I spotted a figure walking slowly down the street, someone I recognized with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. It was Cassandra Everett, but she was not the fierce, unyielding woman from our previous encounters. Instead, her posture was subdued, and her expression was clouded by remorse rather than anger. I hesitated at first but decided that a personal conversation might bring clarity to what was becoming an increasingly complicated narrative. After all, I had spent so many sleepless nights obsessing over security footage and the unraveling of a toxic reign. Perhaps it was time to confront the person behind the mask. "Hello, Ms. Everett," I called out cautiously as I approached her along the quiet sidewalks of Red Mesa. She paused, her eyes softening for a brief moment before hardening again with residual hurt. "I never expected to see you out here." There was a fragile quality to her tone, a mixture of regret and uncertainty that I hadn't witnessed before. Her response came after a long silence. "Mr. Miles, I wanted to speak with you," she began haltingly. The conversation, which started with a few awkward pleasantries, soon turned toward the events that had disrupted our community. I listened intently as she shared her side of the story, a tale of personal insecurities, a sense of isolation that had driven her to extreme measures, and the deep-seated biases that had, in part, fueled her actions. "I realize now that what I did was unforgivable," she said quietly, her voice tinged with genuine sorrow. "I've been in therapy for some time, trying to understand my behavior and confront the prejudice that I never even knew I harbored." As I looked at her, I saw the glimmer of a person who was struggling to overcome a past riddled with self-hatred and misguided anger. There was a vulnerability to her admission that was both disarming and, in a strange way, humanizing. I responded with measured candor, "Ms. Everett, your actions caused a great deal of pain and disruption, not just for me but for many in our community. I can't simply erase that, and forgiveness isn't something that comes easily. However, I do believe that if you are sincere about changing, then this might be a starting point for both of us." My words, though guarded, carried a sense of possibility, an invitation to transform bitter history into something that could potentially foster growth. Our conversation lingered in that quiet space on the sidewalk. I could see the conflict in her eyes. Regret mixed with the stubborn pride of someone who had spent years defending her worldview. "I know I have a long way to go," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness, but I truly want to change. I want to be a person who stands for something better than hate." Her words echoed in my mind, stirring something I had long thought buried, the realization that even those who have hurt us in the worst ways can, sometimes, find a path toward redemption. As we parted ways that day, the encounter left an indelible imprint on both of us. For me, it reinforced the notion that true justice isn't solely punitive, it can also be transformative. While I remained cautious, I promised myself that I would continue to support efforts aimed at healing our fractured community. I also resolved to encourage dialogue among neighbors, an exchange of views that could help prevent further cycles of resentment and retaliation. In the weeks that followed, I observed subtle shifts. Cassandra, once the architect of discord, appeared more subdued in community gatherings, and her once harsh criticisms were now tempered with a quiet humility. Though it was too early to call it forgiveness, our meeting had planted the seeds for something resembling understanding. Amid all the noise and chaos of the past months, that personal encounter shone like a beacon, a reminder that change, however incremental, always starts with the courage to face the truth. In the aftermath of our in-person conversation, a tentative peace began to settle over Red Mesa. Although not everything was resolved, a fragile truce was evident in the way neighbors interacted. I, Terrence Miles, continued to monitor my property with the same steadfast security system, but now its role had evolved. It was no longer just my shield against potential intruders, it had become a silent testament to the community's slow, but sure, transformation. Every morning, I would sip my coffee on the front porch, occasionally glancing at the familiar security cameras mounted on the wall. Their unblinking gaze reminded me that vigilance was still necessary, yet it also offered a sense of reassurance. Conversations at the local grocery store now included muted references to recent events, a willingness to acknowledge that the past need not dictate our future. I observed that while some residents still whispered behind closed doors about the incident, many began to speak openly about the need for change. The HOA, pressured by mounting public outcry, had initiated an internal review of its long-standing policies. Rumors abounded that a handful of board members were working on revisions that would allow for more modern, less invasive measures of community surveillance and interaction. Slowly, the discourse shifted from one of fear to one of cautious hope. I also noticed that community events, once characterized by an undercurrent of tension, now had a tentative spirit of camaraderie. Several neighbors, previously reticent to speak out, attended discussions at the community center about enhancing both personal security and mutual respect. The collective sentiment was clear: while the scars of the past had not vanished, there was a collective desire to rebuild trust. Sometimes, when I was alone on the porch, I would reflect on how far we had come. The harsh glare of that scorching morning had given way to thoughtful discussions about accountability and empathy. Even Cassandra Everett, whose actions had once sown division and fear, now kept a low profile. While I wasn't entirely ready to forgive, I recognized that our community could use this as an opportunity to heal. I resolved to continue my quiet efforts, both by staying vigilant with my technology and by encouraging open dialogue among my neighbors. A quiet smile often tugged at the corners of my lips whenever I thought about those early days of confrontation. The security cameras, which had once been a source of contention, now stood as silent witnesses to a shift in collective consciousness, a subtle promise that even in the most seemingly immutable corners of suburbia, change could prevail. In this delicate truce, there was space for both caution and optimism. I remained determined to uphold my right to protect my property while also fostering an environment where respect and understanding could flourish. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt possible that the wounds of the past might one day heal, replaced by a community united not by uniformity, but by a shared commitment to progress and compassion. Several months after the tumult, the community of Red Mesa had begun to exhibit subtle signs of genuine renewal. I, Terrence Miles, had gradually returned to a state of calm normalcy in my daily routine. The once harsh echoes of confrontation had softened, replaced by quiet murmurs of reconciliation and progress. The security system remained on my wall, its lens a steadfast guardian over my property, and as a reminder of the turbulent journey we'd endured. It was during a mild autumn afternoon that I received a brief, unadorned letter in the mail. The envelope bore no return address but was signed by Cassandra Everett. With cautious curiosity, I opened it and found that it contained a heartfelt apology. In plain, unpretentious handwriting, Cassandra admitted that her actions, fueled by long-held biases and a desperate need for control, had been out of line. She spoke of her struggles with isolation, the misguided pressures of conforming to an outdated neighborhood ideal, and a sincere desire to change. Cassandra acknowledged the pain she had caused and offered no excuses, only regret. Her words stirred conflicting emotions within me, resentment for the past, yet also a reluctant recognition of the possibility for transformation. As I read her confession, I remembered that every act of transgression, no matter how severe, sometimes opens the door to redemption. Cassandra explained that she had begun attending counseling, learning to embrace the rich diversity of our community rather than fear it. Her tone was humble, and though I couldn't say that I fully forgave her, I recognized the courage it took to admit fault and seek help. In the days following the receipt of that letter, the neighborhood itself began to show signs of healing. Community meetings, once dominated by hushed whispers of discontent, gradually shifted to more open and constructive dialogue. Formerly polarized residents started to find common ground on issues of mutual respect and safety. The HOA, pressured by the outpouring of public sentiment, initiated a review of its policies. It was as if the events that had once threatened to fracture our community were now slowly drawing us together in a shared desire for progress. Personally, I felt a quiet relief. I continued my work, guarding my property and living as I always had, yet I also recognized that the road to genuine redemption was long and complex. Cassandra's apology, while not a panacea, marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where accountability and compassion could coexist. I decided to respond with measured kindness. I penned a brief note in return, expressing that while the past could not be undone, I was willing to support efforts toward a more inclusive and respectful community. On crisp evenings, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee and glancing at the familiar security cameras, I remembered that even the deepest wounds might slowly heal when met with sincerity and a willingness to change. Though caution still lingered, the promise of a fresh start had become tangible. That letter from Cassandra was not an erasure of history, but rather a stepping stone toward a more hopeful future, a future in which every resident, regardless of background, could find a place to belong. Thus, as the days turned to weeks and the bitter echoes of the past dulled into memory, I embraced a newfound optimism. In the simple act of forgiveness and the courage to begin anew, I found that even in the toughest, most unforgiving landscapes, the seeds of transformation could take root, and ultimately flourish.